All right, Trace, go ahead.
All right, so let's get started tonight on this new COVID-19 update. There's a ton of new information out there. We're going to blow through a little bit of information regarding some treatment updates because there are some changes there that have been fairly recent. When you think of a dynamic topic, it is COVID-19, as you all could guess, because there's breaking news every day on it. So we're going to look at some treatments, vaccines. We're going to talk about fact, fiction, and even some conspiracy theories, which is why you see the cat with the tinfoil hat here on this first slide. Greg, you want to do this slide?
Sure. And let me just kind of introduce, Tracy. Tracy is a pharmacist. She has her own practice pharmacy in the Philadelphia area. She also teaches at Salus University. And she and I have been sharing the podium, probably about 3 or 4 years now tonight. So it's always a pleasure to have Tracy with us from the pharmacist side. We usually try and do 50-50 on the presentations, but this is going to be 98% and 2%. Basically, the fact or fiction were the questions that I called her up and said, what's going on? So that's how we came up with the title of this one. With regarding disclosures, there's going to be many companies mentioned tonight. I haven't lectured for any of them, don't have any financial interests. You could see the rest of it. Nothing that's on this list has influenced this talk tonight. Tracy.
Actually, before you start, I've got a quick housekeeping question. Is this TQ? Somebody asked.
It is not TQ. It is not TQ.
Somebody asked that.
Yep. The questions keep the reason being the topic just keeps changing so quick that we wasn't even sure how to even make the questions so that they'd be relevant in about 3 or 4 weeks. So that's why we made that decision.
And looking at my disclosures here, I have no financial interest in any of the products and have not received any assistance nor any commercial interest, which I guess I already said, in the making of this course. So getting started here, we're going to look at just a few things in review. Just looking at the name again for anybody who maybe has woken up after an 8-month slumber. Disease state, if we're talking about, and actually it's a good taking a step back and looking at kind of how we're going to refer to different parts of the lecture in terms of different names you're going to hear. So everybody knows COVID-19, that's the actual disease state. And according to the World Health Organization, you can see here, this is where the name comes from, CO and corona, VI, virus, disease, 2019. So COVID, disease, or COVID-19. And then when we're talking specifically about the organism, it comes from the severe acute respiratory syndrome, coronavirus 2. So that's that SARS-CoV-2. And you'll hear me kind of going back and forth depending upon the specific topic that we're talking about or kind of how we're approaching it. And over here on the right, on the upper right-hand side, you can see the spike protein on this drawing, computer drawing of SARS-CoV-2. And this spike protein, S1, S2, is specifically, am I in drawing mode somehow? Can you see that, Greg?
Yes, Trace, we don't actually know how that happens. It may actually be a quirk involving one of our attendees. The best way to get over this is stop sharing your screen for a moment and then share again.
All right.
It happens frequently.
Oh, well, that's a new one. Okay.
And just share again.
There we go. So going back to the spike protein, this is where our target is for our vaccines as well as our medications. For the most part, you have a couple of non-specific medications like our steroids, but in general, you're going to hear me referring to this over and over as the target for many of our therapeutic entities as well as our vaccines. It's essentially one of the most important components of how we're really kind of advancing our treatment and prevention of this disease. Okay, now we got another problem. Oh, there we go. Part of the outline, just running through, for COPE and all that good stuff, running through the signs and symptoms of COVID. This has really kind of evolved, as you know, from the beginning of the pandemic and then over weeks and months. Initially in March, everybody said, oh, it's respiratory, nasal symptoms, lung symptoms, coughing, etc., and really no GI symptoms and no sore throat initially, etc. And it's really evolved into, it can be pretty much almost anything. I saw a patient here, or knew of a patient, I should say, that had a really severe earache and had a COVID ear infection, and it was a remarkable tympanic membrane. So it's presenting in all kinds of crazy ways. But the graphic on the right there, the COVID-19 symptoms and warning signs, everybody knows that this is essentially the worrisome symptoms that typically start, 5, 6, 7 days after, or sometimes even longer, after a patient has been infected with SARS-CoV-2 and has developed COVID-19. The fever, cough, shortness of breath, persistent pain or chest pressure, and then bluish lips or face. So we're going to look at some treatments that are very specifically aimed at some of our early symptoms, and we want to make sure that they're started within, the fastest period of time after diagnosis and or onset of symptoms. And then we have some therapeutic entities that really are reserved for patients who are much more severely ill. And we'll go through some of those emergency use authorizations. I liked this graphic. I'm a visual learner. Of course, in your slides, it's probably, size 1.5 font, ant size font.
Yeah, it looks good.
Oh, good. So over here on the left, I put a red box around the SARS-CoV-2, looking at its journey into the nose and mouth and eyes and how it travels. And you can just see kind of some of these alveoli with moderate disease kind of down here more towards the mid left, and then severe disease down here on the way left. And it's a great read, just kind of showing you the SARS-CoV-2 structure, the specific viral infection over here on the right. And I thought it was a great discussion in very succinct context, looking at the immune response, and then essentially what you get with the severe inflammatory response system, or SIRS, which that's what eventually can lead to septic shock and organ failure. We've also seen, as I go to the next slide here, there was that Congressman-elect that died about a week ago, and he had a very atypical presentation as well. He did not die from respiratory issues. He had I think he had a blood clot initially, or anyhow, he ended up having a heart attack and then went into heart failure. And then I think a blood clot maybe killed him. But anyhow, it was cardiac, and that was the issue with him. So we're constantly surprised with this disease. We know transmission has kind of morphed or evolved like many things associated with COVID-19 over the past 9 months. Difference between droplet and airborne over here to the left, which most of you probably know, but our droplet transmission, that's why we're wearing our masks, not only to protect ourselves, but to protect others. And that's changed as well. Seemingly on weekly to monthly basis. Droplet transmission is the cough and sneezes that come, via saliva and mucus. And then that airborne transmission, these are the really teeny particles that are typically produced by talking, and they can be suspended in the air. There are crazy estimates, 3 hours. There are some estimates that you see online that even say maybe up to 10 hours. I don't know. I'm not an expert in that, but that seems like a long time. What I want you to see here is the size. So the droplet particles are more than 5 microns, which is pretty small. And then the airborne transmission, those are less than 5 microns. So you see here in this WHO BBC picture that human hair is 60 to 120 microns, just to give you a perspective. So tiny particles. And that's also one of the big controversies in terms of why the masks initially were, no, don't wear a mask, it's not going to help at all. And that was some of the issue, was the size of the actual virus and the particles. We know that these droplets can settle on surfaces, doorknobs, tables, optometric equipment that you're using for your patients as well. And again, I think we've let up a little bit on this. We're not quite as crazy. I hate to say crazy, but adamant maybe is a better word for cleaning things off. And I don't know if that's good or bad, but there's some information out there saying that there's a very small chance that people can get the infection from surfaces compared to what we used to think. But we should still be diligent in cleaning things for sure.
Tracy, we had a comment just as you can take a breather there, that someone had severe lower back pain is common. and this person knew it firsthand. It's in the chat. And then to kind of give someone a little bit of, how big 5 microns is that if you take a millimeter and cut it 1,000 times, it would be 5 of those slices. Or your new OCTs, the spectral domain OCTs out there, when you're looking at a retina and seeing all the detail, it has to be about 5 or 6 microns for the OCT to see it. So just to kind of give people a little bit of what 5 microns is. Please go ahead.
Sure, that was a great example to give some perspective. Don't forget that some of these viruses and particles, or individual viruses and particles, can go through ventilation systems. And then probably everybody heard the story of the blow up Santa that was in a San Jose hospital, I believe, on Christmas Day. And these things have a fan, so there was a person in it, but they stay blown up because there's a fan inside. And the best guess is that this was the most likely suspect in infecting 60 people as of yesterday, and 1 person has died. There's only one other thing that they're looking at as a potential culprit. So again, we learn as we go. And what about masks? I kind of alluded to this, so I'm not going to spend much time, but there's been much debate from the beginning of this pandemic. Do we wear masks? We were told no. And then, oh my gosh, everybody has to wear a mask. And it depends upon what type of material and what size and how it fits, et cetera. And in general, I'm a big mask advocate, because we are constantly learning that we don't know as much as we think we know. And it is evolving at a rapid pace. So, by and large, my recommendation, and, I'm really adamant about it, is we just need to wear them. And that also is included with the vaccine. Once we get the second dose of our vaccines, we're probably going to wear them, for some period of time, despite the fact that we will have immunity of upwards of 95% with the 2 current vaccines, in some short degree of in perpetuity, really, until we have a large number of people vaccinated. So that's going to be an interesting issue that's going to kind of change over the next few weeks, potentially. There's not much discussion about it yet in terms of the vaccines. Some good news, we've seen cases of influenza really low this year. Some of it has to do with the fact that in the United States, influenza doesn't really peak until deeper into the winter and into the early spring, but also everybody's wearing masks, they're social distancing, etc. But flu shots are available still, and if you haven't gotten your flu shot, go get your flu shot. We don't really know how effective they are this year, simply because the cases are so low. So anyhow, just one more little piece of advice to go get your flu shot as well. Screening for symptoms and PPE, just a couple comments here. Many more places are screening patients for signs and symptoms of COVID, which is great. Anything from hair salons to, any place where you can go and have an appointment, into a primary care, to an optometric practice. Even pharmacies are doing that. And the good news is, with all of this and all of the changes in lifestyle and kind of, all the changes we've made in terms of how we just stay away from people, now we see more elective surgeries and general medicine type things back in the swing of things. Physicals, procedures, eye exams, and eye surgeries, they've been open for business for some months in most states. Most of them do require a negative COVID test, and then you have to quarantine for some period of time if it's a surgical procedure. PPE, I think availability is getting a bit better. I mean, I think it's much better here in Pennsylvania. And we know a little bit more than we did in March in terms of, what a PPE is appropriate, et cetera. So we're making great progress in that regard. And it's perfectly in time with, the vaccines being rolled out. Polling question number 1.
Polling question number 1 is launched. It says, can you get COVID-19 more than once? Fact or fiction? People are experienced with this and they're rolling in here nicely. And we'll end the poll right about now. And I'll share the results. And it says 97% say fact, Tracy, and 3% say fiction.
All right, pretty good guess, heavy on the fact. And, for the most part, we know this to be true. So we're going to say that this is a fact. Oh, I think this is, there we go. Fact or fiction? Can we get COVID-19 more than once? And that is a fact. And I guess if you missed the fact the first time, I did it a second time. So what we do know about this is that, reinfections is extremely uncommon. We think it can happen. It's less than 10 people globally at this point, depending upon where you read. But the vast majority of people who do get infected a second time will not be as sick and typically do not end up hospitalized. But this is really going to be an interesting thing to watch over the next months to years, with the vaccines rolled out and people who were infected with COVID very early in the pandemic. So we'll wait and see. But it does, again, kind of reiterate the need for continued protective practices. And, who knows how long that's going to occur.
Tracy, this might be the cart way before the horse because we really didn't talk about the vaccines. And I know that there's some other pharmaceuticals you're going to talk before getting there, but someone is asking, once you're vaccinated, are you able to be a spreader? And this person has said she's asked many people and then getting contradicting answers. So given other COVID-19, often we are, once we're vaccinated, are we able to still spread it in a sense?
Well, the only way that you would really be able to spread it, at least for as much as we know now, I mean, the two vaccines that we have out now are between 94 and 95% effective, best guess. Now, keep in mind, and this will just, it's a little early in the presentation, but then I just don't have to say it once we get to the vaccines. They are not FDA approved. Those two vaccines are just available to people in the United States and even worldwide under an emergency use authorization. So we are learning as we go. So I say that because typically with a vaccine, you're not going to get infected with the disease for which the vaccine is being given. But at 95%, that still means that there's a 5% chance that, and if that maintains itself, there's still a 5% chance that someone can get infected with SARS-CoV-2 and develop COVID-19. We're hoping, just like with influenza and other diseases, excuse me, that if you do get it, it'll be a much more mild case, but we're guessing at that. So in that 5%, you could still be a spreader. You won't be shedding the virus because of the vaccine, if that's part of the question. It is not a live nor attenuated vaccine. It's a completely new model with the mRNA. So you won't shed it because of the vaccine. The only way, or you won't spread it, excuse me. The only way that you will really, be able to spread the infection would be if you're part of the 5% that isn't covered, and you develop the infection.
Here's another question I have for you is, sure. You mentioned about the flu vaccine and you and I do a talk on, herpes, and then we talk about the Shingrix vaccination. What's your thoughts on that? Is, are you able to do them fairly close to each other or hold off? What's your thoughts on, herpes zoster or Shingrix?
Along with COVID?
Along with, Moderna or the Pfizer vaccination.
We don't really know is the bottom line,
right.
Because it is a fairly new model with the mRNA. We have it for other diseases, but nothing really that we see here in the United States to any great extent. So right now, I think they're both saying spread out by 2 weeks. It may have been lowered to a week, but I think it's still 2 weeks. So that means you'd have to get, the Shingrix vaccine or the flu vaccine 2 weeks before or 2 weeks after both the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines. We just flat don't know. I mean, we are literally doing the clinical studies while everybody's getting vaccinated.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that just made the hair on the back of my neck stand up a little bit, but that's what a global pandemic does. Everybody's heard of the new mutation that we're starting to see, the UK variant. It's also called B117 variant. It's kind of an interesting perspective on viruses. I mean, a virus's goal in general is to find and invade new hosts, new bodies. So a virus's whole goal is to find and invade new people, new bodies, or, if it's an animal virus, animals. So 60% of people in the UK who are currently infected with SARS-CoV-2 have this new variant, and that's growing by the day. Now, I changed that number. You can see after the 60%, the third bullet down, it's now, as of today, in 47 countries. The only place where this particular mutation has taken root as the kind of alpha or most robust primary COVID-19 variant or SARS-CoV-2 variant, SARS-CoV-2 variant rather, has been the UK. And it makes sense that if this is a more robust virus or variant of the virus, I should say, that this is going to be the one that's going to be the winner, so to speak. But it's only happened in the UK so far. There are many researchers who are predicting that it will, in fact, become the most common variant in the United States. We just don't know yet. 60 plus people, I think that's a couple days old. That's going to go like wildfire. Here's how you can kind of analyze this UK variant. Its transmissibility is much higher compared to the non-UK variant. So the traditional SARS-CoV-2 that we've been dealing with since March. And what that means is if you have somebody who is infected with SARS-CoV-2 and maybe they're asymptomatic or just very mild symptoms, and they're in a room with other people, the R naught basically is saying at this point that they're going to infect, one, maybe two people. I mean, unless you're all sitting in, some sort of close tent where everybody's really close together. But doing everything appropriately, they'll infect maybe one or two people. The transmissibility of this new UK variant says that that same person who has this different variant will infect maybe 3.5 to 4.3 or 4.5 people. So when you start just looking at how many people will end up with this new variant, the transmissibility and the number of cases that will pop up is terrifying, absolutely terrifying. It is not a faster virus, meaning symptoms don't appear faster. It does not seem to be more deadly, and that's what I have here at the bottom. We find it because we do this genetic analysis that's sent to the CDC, and they do the genetic analysis, and they pick up on it initially a lot of times because the viral load tends to be much higher in people who have this UK mutation. So the good news is we don't think it's more deadly, at least we're pretty sure. And we think as of today that it is still covered under the current vaccines. The ones that have not been authorized under the emergency use authorization are, studying it as well. So time will tell. But so far, we think it is probably going to be covered under the new vaccine, which is good.
Tracy,
go ahead, Joe.
A comment came up that South Africa seems to have a variant that is more virulent than what is in the UK.
Yes. I think South Africa, and I could be wrong, but I believe that the South Africa mutation is the B117, but it seems to be even more virulent than the ones, than the variant that is in the UK. I could be wrong on that, but that's my understanding. We have, this variant in so many different countries where it really has not become a huge issue except for the UK. But if somebody has more information on the South Africa variant, if it's slightly different, you can certainly chime in on that. I was going to say.
So Tracy, it popped up here again. Can you please clarify if you can still transmit COVID if you've already been vaccinated? And I'm going to take a crack at it, and then you can fill in the gaps. As my feeling is that, once I'm vaccinated, all that tells me is that my body has the antibodies to beat up this bug, this COVID-19. And there's B memory cells that store the antibody, and that's how we're able to trigger and get a quicker immunity to it and not move into the severe part. So you still might have symptoms. My thought process is if I come in contact and I am hosting this virus, because a virus, that's the big thing, it needs a host, and my body immune system has not reacted to it yet, at that point, I feel that I can transmit it until my immune system, which now has the B memory cells and the vaccinate and the antibody to attack it and then to eradicate it. Then once I get to a point where I'm not hosting the virus because my immune system has kicked in, then we're not able, then you're not going to be a spreader. So I think what happens is that when people don't have this, it takes time for their immune system to kick in, and that's why they spread. And by the time that their immune system kicks in, and then hopefully they don't get the severe respiratory part and they recover, but it's those days what it takes for your body to create the antibodies to beat up this virus. So I think you'll be a much shorter, if you want to say, spreading period, since your body can react to it. But that's my thoughts, Trace. I'll let you kind of, or Joe, you can fill in the gaps.
And I'll give you exactly what the CDC says, because it's an excellent question, and it's something, you know, and just to kind of tell you what the latest brains and expert panel say. So, will a COVID-19 vaccination protect me from getting sick with COVID-19? Yes. COVID-19 vaccine works by teaching your immune system, just like Greg was saying, how to recognize and fight the virus that causes COVID-19. And this protects you from getting sick with COVID-19. Being protected from getting sick is important because even though many with COVID-19 only have mild illnesses, others get severe, et cetera, et cetera. So assuming that you stay in that 95% efficacy, you will not, you know, as far as we know, with the two shots, the initial shot and then the booster, which is the second one, you will not get sick. All things going the direction that we hope. We may need to have boosters on the vaccines. We have no idea how long the immunity is going to last with this. So that's something that is going to continue to be studied. It's a great question, and you know, something that we're all going to be worried about and looking at in the next months to you know, couple of years, maybe longer than that. So again, currently looking at our best options against COVID-19, still prevention, but how are we doing on treatments? So I'm going to do just a quick update on treatments. If you've been to any of my other COVID discussions, you may recognize some of these. I'm just going to do updates on them, you know, primarily so we can get to the viruses or to the vaccines to prevent the viruses. So is there anything effective against COVID-19? You know, we had lists of drugs that were being kind of evaluated, really just almost kind of like guinea pig type scenarios really early in the pandemic. And, you know, of course we would, because we were blindsided essentially. You know, we didn't have any hard science or a lot of research looking at this. So since then, we've had time to kind of sort through the information and really start looking at some studies that have been going on since the beginning or close to the beginning, and look at the hard science, kind of sort through things. So we're still down to about 4 to 6 medications or therapies, I should say, because not all of them are medications. And we're going to look at those real quick. Remdesivir, Veklury. This is that broad antiviral agent that has been evaluated in times past for hepatitis, Ebola, and then other respiratory viruses. It has shown great promise in our non-human primates to begin with, and then also in people. So again, real quick, the mechanism, if you look at that, it's again hitting that spike protein. And this was one of our first medications where we thought, aha, I think we have something here. So as it's evolved over time, you can see there's that spike protein again, S1 and S2 on the right. That's what's going to be our target with Remdesivir. There was initially an emergency use authorization out for Remdesivir. I'm going to read this real quick so everybody understands what an emergency use authorization is, because you're going to hear me mention it multiple times. And again, I will reiterate what I said earlier regarding the vaccines when we had that question or a couple of questions. The only FDA approved anything that we have for COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 is Remdesivir, Veklury. It is the only FDA approved therapy, anything. We don't have any FDA approved vaccines, no other FDA approved treatments. And that's important because we go through a lot of information in the United States and all over the world, you know, as different government agencies evaluate the safety and efficacy of something before it is, you know, sent out for public use in phase 4 post-marketing surveillance. So real quick, an emergency use authorization pursuant to a determination and declaration by the Department of Health and Human Services Secretary, the FDA may authorize an unapproved product or unapproved uses of an approved product like Plaquenil, hydroxychloroquine, for emergency use. The FDA must determine that the product may be effective in diagnosing, treating, or preventing a serious or life-threatening disease or condition caused by a chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear agent. The known and potential benefits outweigh the known and potential risks for the product. The known and potential benefits, it might only be a couple that we have, must outweigh the known and potential risks for the product. That's a tough thing with an EUA. There are no adequate, approved, and available alternatives. That has to be part of the EUA. So you'll hear me refer to this process, the EUA, that the FDA has utilized. So Remdesivir had one very early in the pandemic at the beginning of May, and essentially what we saw there hasn't changed much. So just real quick, this was the original emergency use authorization that said that Remdesivir is typically used in severe disease, which is defined as an oxygen saturation less than or equal to 94%. So essentially your pulse ox on room air, or in patients requiring supplemental oxygen, mechanical ventilation, and or extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. So basically we're trying to keep you alive from the outside in. And it was for adult and pediatric patients 12 years and up. That hasn't really changed much. So it's still used in severe patients. It had an update on the EUA in the end of August. And then if you recall, this was kind of one of the early treatments that was being evaluated, and there was a really controversial move by one of the NIAID researchers where he essentially said, I think it's unethical to give people placebo rather than Remdesivir. So I'm discontinuing the placebo arm of that study. It was a big study. And ever since then, essentially what he said was, we have to stop it early because it's unethical to continue in the way that we're going. So that really kind of sped things along. And there we got, end of October, our first FDA approved treatment for COVID-19. Not that we weren't using it before then, we surely were, but just under the EUA. So by getting the FDA approval, it's essentially telling us, yeah, this drug is safe and effective. We've proven it in however many patients, quite a few for COVID-19, and seems to be doing a great job in the severely ill patients who, have those respiratory symptoms. We use it in combination with other things as well. So it is exactly what I already said here. For the most part, for Remdesivir, it's just once daily injection for 5 to 10 days, and patients did the best when they were started within 10 days of onset of symptoms. That seems like a long time, but onset of symptoms, 10 days, you should really start the Remdesivir. But keep in mind that those respiratory symptoms don't appear typically very early. So that's why we see a delay in treatment. Typical adverse effects and infusion-related reactions, which we see with any medication that uses a needle, increased liver enzymes. So that's something that we watch for sure. GI side effects, kidney issues, septic shock. Nothing's really changed with that. We're just really monitoring it in much more detail. You probably saw when the president of the United States had COVID, that's really where this Regeneron monoclonal antibody cocktail became known to the layperson and the public as well. So there are a couple of monoclonal antibody cocktails or individual monoclonal antibodies available. This is just the most well-known, so I'm going to use this as our example. So this Regeneron monoclonal antibody cocktail got an emergency use authorization in November. It is a combination of two monoclonal antibodies, casirivimab and imdevimab. They have specific numbers that you can see. And again, they bind to that spike protein. Most effective if given to patients shortly after diagnosis. So if you recall, when the president of the United States was diagnosed with COVID, he felt well, but they still took him to Walter Reed, and he was started on the Regeneron monoclonal antibody and Remdesivir pretty much immediately. And who knows, but maybe that's what really helped him to do so well and have a very not exciting, kind of sequence of events as it pertains to COVID. The biggest thing about this is the monoclonal antibodies are best used in patients who have not mounted their own immune response, which is why we want to start it so soon, or in those that have a really high viral load. So going back to that UK variant or that B117 variant, that's what's going to be key when, if anybody ends up in the hospital with that variant, which people already are, starting the monoclonal antibody cocktail literally stat is going to be key because their viral loads tend to be just that much higher with that particular variant. So the EUA essentially said in patients with mild to moderate COVID-19 in adults, as well as in pediatric patients 12 and up, with positive results of direct SARS-CoV-2 viral testing and who are at high risk for progressing to severe COVID-19 and or hospitalization. They are at risk for progressing to severe COVID-19. They are not using this in the sick patients yet because there is some evidence out there suggesting that in the very ill patients with COVID-19, that it may contribute to worse clinical outcomes. So that may change, but right now it's looking that way. In mild to moderate. Most common reported side effects, pretty well tolerated. Nausea, vomiting, maybe some hyperglycemia, which who knows, that could be monoclonal antibody or it could just be the adrenals kind of reacting to the situation, and pneumonia. So again, is the pneumonia from the drug or is the pneumonia from the SARS-CoV-2? Not really sure, but you have to consider every potential side effect when you're looking at a therapeutic entity. Here's the corticosteroids, that dexamethasone that you've seen. Essentially, again, it's in severe COVID-19 patients. We know, because we saw this from the very beginning, that patients sometimes develop that systemic inflammatory response that leads to that severe respiratory problem and multi-organ failure, which results in death a good chunk of the time. So the potential anti-inflammatory effects associated with corticosteroids seems like a no-brainer. The issue has really been that, early in or kind of mid pandemic here, we stopped and said, well, corticosteroids aren't really that beneficial in many other viral illnesses, respiratory syncytial virus, influenza, SARS-CoV-1, and Middle East respiratory syndrome. So then we started to kind of sort through some of the data, and there were several research sites. And what we saw was that patients specifically taking methylprednisolone, that was the drug initially that was being looked at, with moderate to severe COVID-19, ended up with ICU and mechanical ventilation mortality lower than patients who didn't get the corticosteroid. So that data, coupled with a lot of other information, particularly from this recovery trial, which used dexamethasone, showed us actually, the dexamethasone is a great medication to use. The issue is who we use it in. And let me read that to you real quick. The FDA recommends dexamethasone about 8 milligrams, oh, by the way, which is equivalent to, 8 milligrams of dexamethasone, about 35 milligrams, 40 milligrams of prednisone, just to give you an idea, for up to 10 days or until hospital discharge, whichever comes first, for the treatment of COVID-19 in hospitalized patients who are mechanically ventilated, who require supplemental oxygen, but who are not mechanically ventilated. So we're not using it in patients who don't require any type of supplemental oxygen or mechanical ventilation. And again, most glucocorticosteroids are kind of, if you don't have one, use another. And that's what we're doing. If dexamethasone isn't available, then we can use any of the other glucocorticosteroids. So it's so much more exciting than when we were looking at some of this information in March, April, May, June, July, because we have so much more data to show what works and what doesn't. So the nice thing about the corticosteroids is they are a known entity. Now, again, these corticosteroids are FDA approved. They're just not FDA approved for COVID-19. And that's, kind of the rub with some of this and how things get a little hairy. So fairly well tolerated for the short durations, maybe some hyperglycemia that we see with particularly high dose steroids, psychiatric mood changes, exacerbations of infections, and reactivation of some latent infections, but not a huge problem other than maybe the hyperglycemia, with the short-term use. And then there's poor hydroxychloroquine. I kind of teasingly say the identity crisis of this poor drug. It works. No, it doesn't work. Maybe it works. Well, I don't know. If you wear it, if you use it on a Tuesday with a blue shirt and you turn around twice, maybe it'll work. The long and short of it is this drug has been put through the ringer as it pertains to treatment of COVID-19. So I think we've made some decent progress since March, April, May, June, July, August. Most endpoints, we didn't really see a benefit. And then the big issue also became, if you recall, when hydroxychloroquine was used, particularly with azithromycin, we saw that QT prolongation in patients. So that became a big issue because we already have sick patients. Sometimes they're on other medications or have underlying cardiac issues. Then we had the emergency use authorization in June initially, where the FDA said, yeah, in certain situations, we're going to use hydroxychloroquine. And a short time later, it was rescinded, the emergency use authorization. So essentially where it stands now, the general consensus is basically that COVID-19 patients do not benefit from the use of hydroxychloroquine or Plaquenil for treatment. And really the focus now is on prevention. And, I think, I'm an advocate of that. If we get any benefit from a prevention perspective, why not? I mean, it's a relatively innocuous medication. We know the side effects well. We know how to monitor it. And you can see here on this slide, we've had this drug around for 70 years, and the ocular toxicity is not going to occur while patients are using it for COVID-19. You saw that pop up in the news shortly after hydroxychloroquine was being talked about. Oh my gosh, it's going to cause blindness, and, it's going to kill them in 18 different ways. Compared to COVID-19, if this had a benefit, give me the hydroxychloroquine, every day of the week and twice on Sunday. And really, I sort of have come to believe that there is some politics that's come into play with, holy cow, a lot of this, including the vaccines, but surely with the hydroxychloroquine. So I don't know. I guess politics gets involved everywhere. All right, zipping along here still so we can get to our vaccines. Convalescent plasma, which we heard a decent amount about convalescent plasma, in the late summer, early fall, kind of before the monoclonal antibody cocktails like the Regeneron one that we looked through. So convalescent plasma, it has a perfect name because it's literally passive immunization. Again, the picture says it better than I can. We have donors that are giving their plasma. They've had COVID-19. So you have the donor apheresis that occurs, and then they, have the matching ABO compatible plasma that is then given to a patient that has COVID-19. And essentially you are kind of inoculating them against COVID-19 immediately. So it's not a vaccine where the body is mounting the immune response. You are literally taking the antibodies from somebody who's already had it and giving it to another person who has not had COVID-19 but is sick with it. So it certainly is something that we continue to use. As of today, January 10th, we think it's not quite as effective as the monoclonal antibody cocktail, but we're still seeing it used along with Remdesivir in places where either there isn't the monoclonal antibody cocktail available, or that's usually what it is. And you would probably have the glucocorticosteroid along with this as well. So that's where we got our emergency use authorization, and it literally says, you are using the convalescent plasma for treatment of hospitalized patients with coronavirus disease, the COVID-19. What they are saying, the local experts, a lot of this is out of Mayo Clinic. Most of the data is out of Mayo Clinic, and it was a decent improvement in mortality. So the data then suggested that the use of convalescent plasma with COVID-19 in patients that had a high antibody titer, in particular for the convalescent side of things, was effective in reducing the mortality in hospitalized patients. So it's certainly better than nothing, and it's certainly better than well, not nothing. It's better than nothing. I guess I said that. So we still have this emergency use authorization, and it's kind of fallen by the wayside a little bit with some of our new stuff, but we continue to use it until we know something different. All right, anything, boys?
There's a lot of stuff rolling in.
Yes, there is. We should probably take a minute to look at some of these.
Sure.
Can people who are allergic to certain things, such as shellfish, take the vaccine?
That's a great question. Yes, I mean, the simple answer is yes, if you are allergic to shellfish. I'm allergic to shellfish, and I got the vaccine on Friday. The kind of more information that should go along with that question and that answer would be what we do know, and you'll see some of this in the slides, is that if you have had an anaphylactic reaction to a vaccine or anything else, if you've had anaphylaxis, then you are more likely to have an anaphylactic reaction to the vaccine. But the numbers are so low. I can tell you that when we first started kind of compiling the data as the vaccine was initially rolled out, and I'm going to read some of this to you. 1214 to 1223, there were 2 million doses of the vaccine given and 21 cases of anaphylaxis. 2 million, it wasn't quite 2 million, a little less than, but close to 2 million doses of vaccine given in the United States and 21 cases of anaphylaxis. And of those 21 cases, oh, by the way, median age was 40 years old. 17 of them had had anaphylactic reactions to other things. So that's really what we're sticking with right now. If you are a highly allergenic person and you've had, multiple anaphylactic reactions, you're probably not a great candidate for the vaccine right now. But even though the incidence is so low, it's something that we take very seriously, because again, we are studying this as we use it. So, the recommendations are to have at least 3 doses of epinephrine that can be given to a patient, steroids, Benadryl, et cetera, in most vaccine centers. And anybody who's had an anaphylactic reaction in the past needs to stay for 30 minutes after they've had the vaccine for observation. Anybody else can stay for 15 minutes. Now, I mention that because 30 minutes doesn't seem like a heck of a long time to sit if you're worried about an anaphylactic reaction. Most of the anaphylactic reactions, well, in general, they tend to occur quickly, usually within 1 hour of exposure to the drug or the food, but most of them even occur in less than 12, 15 minutes. So that's why we have that recommendation. But that's a great question. Other questions, guys, before I move on here?
A lot of them look like they might get answered by going through the vaccines, Trace.
Okay.
So go through the vaccines, and then we'll come back and revisit some of them. So
sure. So just to compare real quick, the new mRNA vaccines to what we know, what we have. And I get so many questions about the COVID-19 vaccines, because I'm a pharmacist, and they're great questions. Certainly people are nervous about taking them. People are nervous about not taking them. But when you look at them compared to what we already have, vaccine types, first one that you are aware of is the live attenuated vaccine, which is essentially whatever infectious disease that we're dealing with. We have a live virus or bacteria, but it's just kind of obtunded. So it's kind of been made less virulent. It gives you a large immune response because we are, basically giving you a little teeny part of the disease or infection. Risks, immunocompromised patients, sometimes you can actually become infected when you get the vaccine, person-to-person transmission. In other words, you can give some of the virus or bacteria in a vaccinated person to a non-vaccinated person, and they can actually develop the disease. We saw this with the oral polio vaccine in years past, where if you gave a young child an oral polio vaccine, it was a live vaccine, that they would shed it in their stool and people got polio from that. So you can see some of our examples down there as well: MMR, smallpox, chickenpox, etc. And then the second vaccine type that we see commonly is the inactivated or killed vaccine. It gives you a decent immune response, a good immune response, but not as good as a live attenuated organism. May require a booster. So you know exactly those types of vaccines. Think of Shingrix. Shingrix is a live, well, actually it's not. Actually, it's not. The Zostavax was a live attenuated form of a vaccine. With the Shingrix is not a live vaccine nor an inactivated vaccine. It's kind of a combination of what we have. But again, it needs a booster. So anytime you need a booster, that's just to make sure that we're continuing to give something that's going to produce an immune response in the patient and give them the best protection. So with this type of vaccine and the COVID vaccines, it's impossible to infect somebody else because of the vaccine. And that's a really important point to make. So, our influenza vaccines, the majority of them now are inactivated or killed. The only one that has been live has been the nasal vaccine for influenza, and we're not giving that really at all anymore for a number of reasons, but one of them being that you can, potentially spread it to someone or get the flu yourself. It is immunologically impossible to get the flu from the flu vaccine. Doesn't mean you can't get the flu right after you've had it and have a mild or a severe case, but you can't get it from the vaccine. It's an inactivated or killed organism. Now we move to our genetic engineering. This is where we are with COVID. So again, our genetically engineered products typically are using RNA or DNA that is programmed to make copies of this spike protein, this S protein that's on the surface of our SARS-CoV-2. This is what we're going to see, and actually have several slides from Moderna, which are great and kind of shows you how these genetically engineered viruses can turn into, or genetically engineered vaccines work to protect you. So we'll get into that. It is important just to mention that, most of this is under Operation Warp Speed. And I mean, it's important to mention, not from any political stance one way or the other, but just because it's worked. I mean, the Operation Warp Speed facilitated movement of these vaccines very quickly, not because there were shortcuts taken in terms of the number of people that were evaluated, or, we have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of patients if you combine all the vaccine research protocols for, the 6, 7, 8 vaccine candidates that are out there. That's not where the shortcuts were taken. The only thing that was kind of a shortcut was the red tape. It got rid of all the typical red tape that you have to use in order to evaluate some of this. So I have great confidence in the data that we have with the vaccines. And I'm the one that's going to say, I live by the mantra, never use a new therapy unless you absolutely have to. I've said it for 30 years. I'll continue to say it because it does take time. But in this particular sense, it was an effective way to do things. So this means that we just have the HHS, BARDA, which is the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, Department of Defense, et cetera, involved with funding and facilitation of movement and, giving money to the vaccine manufacturers. So let's look at a few of these. Moderna. The Moderna vaccine was the second one that got the EUA. I decided to do this one first in the presentation only because it has great graphics on the mechanism of action. So that's why I'm doing it first. It does consist of a strand of messenger RNA that tells the body to produce the spike protein that the coronavirus uses to latch onto human cells. So the host, we are the host. The mRNA vaccines are fast and flexible, as no live cells or viruses are needed. And that means, we looked at the other two types of vaccines. One was a live attenuated and the other was a killed organism. that's not anything like what we have here with the mRNA. We didn't require a virus to manufacture these. It did require the genetic sequencing of a virus, which I'll show you, but the actual substance that's contained in the vaccine is not a virus. So March 27th, NIH announced Emory University would start looking at the Moderna vaccine. Think about it. That was 9 months ago, and we have this vaccine candidate. So here's our emergency use authorization, December 18th. Remember that date. You knew it was in December, but remember December 18th, because what we really have to look at here, which is going to be just galling, is the fact that if we don't ramp up vaccination in all 50 states, we will be throwing away doses of Moderna and Pfizer vaccine. So I'll show you those dates here in a moment. So December 18th was the EUA, and I would say maybe December 20th, 21st is when people actually had them in their hot little hands to give to each other and to patients. All right, real quick, this is the beautiful mechanism. It comes from this ModernaATX.com for the next several slides. So we first had isolation of the virus from an infected patient in China, and most, if not all, of the vaccines, the two that we currently have, and then most, if not all, that are in development, use the same genetic sequencing from this one patient in China in March. So you have this isolation of the virus, the SARS-CoV-2, from this patient in China, and then the virus was sequenced and its genetic information was placed into a public database, and that's where all the researchers and pharmaceutical companies were able to access it. The NIH and Moderna, this is a plug for Moderna, not by me, by them, this was their verbiage, but the NIH and Moderna worked together to identify the sequence of a key protein on the surface of SARS-CoV-2 called the spike protein. You could say the NIH and Pfizer, the NIH and AstraZeneca, the NIH and Duke University, because everybody did the same thing. So we have this spike protein, we have this genetic information, and this is where messenger RNA comes into play. So the instructions for making this spike protein, because of the genetic sequencing that was found, were encoded into mRNA, and that's what's given to patients as a vaccine. Now, well, I won't skip ahead. We'll talk a little bit about the mRNA and the question with DNA. But what we have here is that, it's injected so far. The two vaccines that we have are injected in the deltoid muscle. And once in the deltoid muscle, it kind of slowly seeps out and kind of schmelts its way through to the lymph nodes, where it's then able to instruct cells to make copies of the spike protein as if the body was infected with SARS-CoV-2. And that's where that wonderful immunity that Greg was talking about earlier kind of goes into action to protect a patient. And what we do know is that once these cells go into effect and the body's learning different ways to protect itself against SARS-CoV-2, the patient endogenously makes their own vaccine against the virus. That's essentially what this mRNA vaccine does, or any of them that will be coming out, is the patient is sort of manufacturing their own viral vaccine that will protect them. What we know is that once you get your first dose of the two vaccines that are available, and it'll probably be the same with the others, you have the benefit of that one dose, which is about 50%, maybe 60%, 2 weeks later. And then for the Pfizer vaccine, you get the second dose 3 weeks after the first, and these are pretty strict guidelines. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And with the Moderna vaccine, which is the one we're on, you get your first dose, and then you get the second dose 4 weeks later. And about 2 weeks between them is when you have the maximum benefit or the maximum protection from that particular dose. And then you get the booster, and that's where we go up to the 95%. So I have here for Moderna, 94.1 to 95% effective. Pfizer's made a big deal that theirs is 95% effective and Moderna's is 94.1% effective, but we're playing with such small slivers of numbers that most people say that Moderna is 95% effective. So we get that shield of endogenous protection. Oh, I had to put stars on that because it was remarkable. All right, polling question number 2.
All right, it's launched.
The Moderna vaccine has luciferase in it that gives people the mark of the beast and a tracking device. So it's like a 2-for-1. Uh-oh. Fact or fiction? The Moderna vaccine has luciferase in it that gives people the mark of the beast and a tracking device. There's much discussion about this
There is.
online, and I've had this question 3 times actually at work.
Everyone's rolling in here nicely with so that or Trace, I'm not sure if you want to disclose. It was a question. Which one did you get?
Oh yeah, no, I have no problem. I got the Moderna.
Yeah.
I would have been fine with either one, but what you're going to find out is most places you're not going to have a choice. Most places they're going to say, here's what you need to worry about with the Pfizer vaccine. Here's what you need to worry about with the Moderna vaccine. And you're essentially signing off that, yeah, either one's fine. And you get what they have.
Yep.
All right. You got the results there, Captain?
Yep, I ended. I'll share them right now. I didn't share them. That's the issue why you're not seeing them. So,
Oh, we got a couple people that think yes, but the large majority of people think that the Moderna vaccine does not have luciferase in it and that it does not give you a tracking device. It's an important discussion. Listen, there's stuff that goes on that probably would make our hair stand on end. So I think that these are reasonable things to kind of evaluate. So let's at least sort through what luciferase is very quickly and talk about this tracking device. All right, so fact or fiction? So there we go. For dramatic effect, I have it scrolling in. Let's see what we got. It is fiction. It is fiction, at least the best we know. I mean, I didn't go on the dark web or anything to answer these questions, but so I loved this meme. I guess it's a meme. One of these things changes your behavior. It contains a microchip which constantly records wherever you go and everything you do or say. And that's true. I mean, Alexa is listening to me right now, which makes me nervous. The other is a life-saving vaccine. So let's sort through it a little bit more. A thumbs up for a mask and the vaccine. What the heck is luciferase? So somebody initially asked me this question probably right around the election. I don't know why that's important, but that's where I remember having the discussion. So they said, I'm not going to get the Moderna vaccine or the Pfizer vaccine. I think it was specifically the Moderna one they were worried about. Which if I were going to worry about one, it wouldn't be those two for the luciferase. So we'll get through a little bit more of that. But some conspiracy theorists, the tinfoil hatters, believe that one of the vaccines has the patent 666, which is the mark of the beast or the devil, I guess, the 060606, which if you look at the actual patent on the second bullet there, it's W020200606A1. So that's where that number came from. So you do see the 3 embedded 6s there. It is a patent that has been submitted for an insertable microchip system that rewards the body activity with cryptocurrency, which to me is terrifying, but it has nothing to do with the vaccines. It's a Bill Gates technology that was applied for in 2020. So I guess you can get implanted with this device and you get cryptocurrency for running an extra mile, but it's not in the vaccines, at least as far as we know. And then we have luciferase. These kind of tend to go hand in hand, and just for time purposes. So this is interesting. Countries with underdeveloped medical systems and care have been evaluated in terms of different ways that potentially would make it easier to track who got vaccinated against what and who didn't. So the main reason is that there just aren't good record keeping in many developing nations or those with underdeveloped medical systems. So we have this bioluminescence. Bill Gates apparently suggested that an invisible ink tattoo would be a reasonable thing to consider in these underdeveloped medical system countries. So his point, if it was Bill Gates, and that's the theory, story was that you have this invisible ink tattoo that has an enzyme in it, this luciferase. So you see Lucifer at the beginning and ace at the end, which shows you it's an enzyme. Lucifer in Greek means bringer of light, and ace is the enzyme. So that's where you get the name, simple as that. But anyhow, if you have a phone or a certain device, you'd have a very specific wavelength of light that would be shown to that spot. It would be the same spot in every patient where they would have this invisible ink tattoo, and the bioluminescence would occur because of this luciferase enzyme, and you'd be able to see who was vaccinated and who was not. So I don't know. Does it seem like a great idea? Monday, I think yes. Tuesday, I think no. Wednesday, I'm not sure. I'm just confused. I don't know, but that's where it comes from. There is not luciferase in any of the current vaccines. So dosing information and side effects, I'm going to kind of include this as a twofer for the both vaccines that are under emergency use authorization. So I already said this, but it's important to reiterate. The Moderna vaccine has not been approved and licensed by the FDA. That's why it doesn't have a brand name. It's just called the Moderna vaccine, and it has a number because it has not been approved by the Food and Drug Administration. It's only under the emergency use authorization. So we'll see when it finally gets approved. I'm sure it will. Indicated for people 18 and up. Pfizer vaccine is indicated for people 16 and up. 2-dose series, 28 days apart. A little bit of information on storage because this is hugely significant right now. The Moderna vaccine can be kept for 6 months in the freezer, but once in the refrigerator, it's good for 30 days. So let's say that again. The Moderna vaccine is good for 6 months in the freezer. And oh, by the way, that freezer is the one that's at the Moderna manufacturing plant, or for 30 days in a refrigerator. So essentially what we're dealing with, if somebody has and all of these, oh, by the way, have GPS trackers and temperature monitoring systems in place. So the pharmaceutical company can literally tell you and Pfizer's is a little more sophisticated, but they can literally tell you if you have a box of vaccines that are not the right temperature. So that's a great device for sure. But what we're looking at here is if all the Moderna vaccines are now sitting in refrigerators at the hospitals and different sites all over the world, and keep in mind, we've only 22 million doses have been deployed of the vaccines, both of them. 22 million doses of Pfizer and Moderna vaccines have been employed. 7 million doses have been given. So we are not doing a great job. A lot of it is just red tape, governmental red tape in each state and sometimes in the counties. But under this piece of information, what we realize here is that there will be however many doses of Moderna vaccine that need to be discarded as of, if we use that December 18th timeframe, somewhere between January 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th. We will have Moderna doses unused that have to be discarded in, the third week of January. That's despicable and really just something that shouldn't occur. We know that I do have one little point here. Notice it says 2-dose series, 28 days apart, less than or equal to 4 days grace period. That is interesting because most of the time, Shingrix is a perfect example. You get your first dose of Shingrix vaccine. You are then supposed to get the second dose 2 to 6 months later. But if you, decide, I don't feel like getting it, or pandemic happens and you don't really want to get it during the pandemic, you could go 3 years later and get your second dose of Shingrix, and you're pretty much going to be fine. We don't give doses early of vaccines, but it's usually not a problem giving it late. And we pretty much never restart a vaccine series unless you've done titers or antibodies and you don't have immunity to it. With this vaccine, the Moderna, there is a 4-day grace period. So that means that you maybe could get it a couple days early, but you definitely don't even want it to get more than 4 days late. So if it's 28 days, the max you can do is 32. And that's because we don't have the information to show whether or not it's going to affect efficacy in a patient. So, we're researching it as we go. The vaccines are not interchangeable, so you don't start with the Moderna and end with the Pfizer vaccine. You have to stick with what you have because we have no idea whether or not that's going to change how the immune system responds, despite the fact that they're both mRNA vaccines. Generally very well tolerated. Injection site reactions, pain, swelling, redness, fatigue, headache, fever, muscle pain, joint pain, chills, nausea, vomiting. Greg and Joe, I will mention, somebody said earlier during the discussion that they had, really bad lower back pain when they had COVID. I will tell you, I mean, I'm pretty much, I grew up as a military kid, so I'm pretty much the suck it up buttercup kind of person. But I will tell you, I got the vaccine on Friday. And I worked out in the afternoon. My arm still hurts. The flu vaccine sometimes hurts, but this was a bugger. But that's no big deal. But I will tell you, Friday night I did not sleep a wink. I went to bed at 11 and got up at 4, and I didn't sleep a wink because my body hurt from the neck down, just aches and pains. I mean, I guess a smart person probably would have taken, ibuprofen, but I kept thinking, no, I can muscle through it. And it was brutal. I mean, I felt fine. I just hurt from my neck down. By yesterday I worked a 10-hour shift. I was fine last night. So it's interesting to see kind of how people react. And those are sort of the typical ones. Any questions that have popped up yet, Greg or Joe?
There's a few. One that just came in. The question is, why the pain?
Oh, well, some of it, that's a great question because again, we're going to compare it to what we know. The Shingrix vaccine, if you've had it or you know anybody who has had it, that's kind of the closest relative that I can kind of explain the concept. The Shingrix vaccine, your arm hurts because you're stabbing a pretty big gauge needle into a big muscle. But with Shingrix in particular, some people get huge reactions at the injection site. And with that, it's usually because you're having great immunity that's occurring from the vaccine itself. With the COVID vaccine, I think it's probably a combination of both. It's the fact that, you're jabbing a decent gauge needle into the deltoid muscle. But also I think we're having, some immunity almost immediately, or, I guess it was within 4 or 5 hours. And that's, essentially what we believe is happening. So it's a good thing. It's a good thing.
Are there any pre-existing conditions that make the vaccine contraindicated?
Well, that's a great question. And actually, we're going to go through that now. So we'll get to some more questions. Let's answer that current question by going through some of this. Who should avoid getting the Moderna vaccine or the Pfizer vaccine? Again, kind of 2 for 1. If you have an allergy to the vaccine or vaccine components. Well, who the heck would know if you have an allergy to the vaccine or vaccine components? Well, that's a great question if I don't say so myself. You would know because you had a first dose. If your first dose, you're not going to know before you get it. But if you have a bad reaction to the first dose, in other words, anaphylaxis, hospitalization, then you shouldn't get the second dose. But that's the only way you would know. We'll go through some other ADRs and contraindications shortly, but let's get to our third polling question.
And what?
Oh, go ahead, Joe.
The polling question is, immunocompromised patients should not get COVID vaccine, fact or fiction? But 2 questions came in while everybody's weighing in on the poll. What about people, women who are pregnant and nursing? What about the vaccine for them?
That's a great question. I don't quite know what to say about this. We will vaccinate pregnant women. I mean, I don't have any concern regarding breastfeeding. And as the polling question is going on, I'll give you the latest CDC recommendations. COVID vaccine, because literally this changes almost on a weekly basis, if not a daily basis. All right. How's the polling thing coming, Joe?
Coming well. We're at 90% of people.
Okay, so it really hasn't changed. So as we look at that, I will answer the question real quick. I just wanted to see, there was some question on, pregnancy and breastfeeding are different as it pertains to therapeutics. I just wanted to make sure nothing changed in the past 5 days. So we don't do pregnancy tests before the COVID-19 vaccine. If somebody is pregnant, we give the COVID-19 vaccine, and there's no question of, problems that we know of. And breastfeeding is the same way. Great question. So immunocompromised patients should not get the COVID vaccine. We have 25% that say fact and 75% that say fiction. So that's a little more of a spread compared to some of the others. So what do we end up with, fact or fiction? So the answer to that is, we think fiction. This is a really hard question. And I can tell you, I have about 12 emails still sitting unanswered in the past 5 days from people I work with, or even family and friends saying, I have this, should I get the COVID vaccine? And the bottom line is, we are saying, yes, get the COVID vaccine. And for the most part, it is not a question of whether or not it's going to hurt you. In an immunocompromised situation, and there are the disease states that we'll run through real quick, but in an immunocompromised situation, for this vaccine, the question is it going to be as effective? In our old-fashioned vaccines like Zostavax, which was a live attenuated vaccine, and some of our other vaccines, they can harm a patient who's immunocompromised. But our newer vaccines, including the COVID vaccine, the biggest question is it going to produce enough immunity? Will we get the 95% efficacy in somebody who has an immunocompromised state? It could be due to disease or medications. Some examples that have been looked at: HIV, cancer, steroids, biologics for autoimmune diseases. CDC currently recommends that these patients do receive the vaccine. The next question is, which one should they take? We don't know. There are some people, there was some little blurb online that said patients who are immunocompromised should wait and get the AstraZeneca vaccine. I am pretty much a staunch no on that, simply because the AstraZeneca vaccine right now is at 70% efficacy. So why would you want to give a vaccine to somebody who already has a compromised immune system that is, 25% less effective than what is currently under the emergency use authorization? So that's what you have, in people that have kind of different immune systems. And we really, unless you are in perfect 100% homeostasis, you have your body is immunocompromised, so to speak. So that's why we're evaluating all these patients kind of as we go along. None of us really have a perfect body and a perfect state of health. So we're going to have to recheck as we go along. It is not currently recommended to do antibody testing post-vaccine in the general population, but in the immunocompromised patients, I think it's going to be. It has to be. Check it 3 months, 6 months, et cetera, and make sure that they're covered. What happens if they're not? What happens if at 3 or 6 months later they get their antibodies tested and it shows that maybe they have 40% efficacy? You give them a booster. They may need 3 or 4 doses maybe of the vaccines. Other disease states that need to be avoided, we don't really know. The studies that are continually being evaluated, not only with the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine, as well as the others that are currently under evaluation and development, they're trying to enroll patients of other ethnicities, the Latino population, the African American population, anything that's not sort of the typical, Caucasian patient. We need to know, is it going to be different in different races or ethnicities? And additionally, we are trying to have bigger studies where they're going to enroll patients that have a variety of different diseases and comorbidities, I should say, and ages, trying to enroll more elderly people in these vaccine studies. So we'll know more as time kind of goes on. Here's our Pfizer vaccine. It's just a different picture. I thought this was a good one too. It's just a more succinct version, but it's essentially the same thing that's happening with the Moderna vaccine. The verbiage is a little bit different, but it's pretty much the same. So what do we have here? This was the first one that had that EUA, emergency use authorization from the FDA, December 11th. And that was truly a banner day for the, for everybody in the United States. Both of these vaccines were available earlier in the United Kingdom, which, was kind of galling to people all over the world. And it really didn't need to happen. The FDA kind of, I don't know, sat on it for a little while, but nonetheless, we got it on December 11th. Again, it's mRNA technology, 2 doses like Moderna, 4 weeks apart. Actually, Pfizer is 3 weeks apart. That's a mistake. I apologize. Moderna's 4 weeks apart. Pfizer is 3 weeks apart. I have a typo there. This one is for people 16 years and up. And this one is the one that you've heard has the help, I guess I should say, of FedEx and USPS to some extent, because it has to be stored at minus 70 Celsius, which is minus 94 Fahrenheit. That is crazy. And the typical freezers that are available pretty much anywhere, unless you're meant to have one like that, they don't go that cold. So Pfizer sends the vaccine in kind of frozen packs that can be left unopened for 10 days. So it can arrive from the Pfizer plant on a refrigerated truck or plane that's minus 94 Celsius in the boxes where the vaccines are being stored upon distribution. They can sit in that box for 10 days. So that buys us 10 days. Once opened, and they go into a regular freezer, I wrote all this down, they can sit for 30 days, if you keep putting dry ice on it every 5 days. And again, the Pfizer has that temperature system that will alert Pfizer if it's not at optimum temperatures. So we've got 10 days left unopened once it's distributed, 30 days if the site continues to put dry ice in every 5 days. Once it comes off dry ice and it's in the fridge, you got another 5 days. So we have about 45 days start to finish for the Pfizer vaccine, which if you take December 11th into consideration and maybe throw a few days on it saying, okay, well, it was sent December 11th, but they didn't start really deploying it into patients until 2-3 days later. We're looking at January 26, 27, 28, and 29, where we're going to have to start throwing away Pfizer doses of the vaccine. So hopefully we are just going to go gangbusters in the next couple of weeks, just rolling it out into different phases, which we'll talk about here momentarily. So what else? ADRs are similar to Moderna, and we're going to look at the allergy discussion here briefly in a moment. Time in our study data and our early cold freezer will really give us what we need, to evaluate this candidate over time. These are some of the most promising vaccine candidates. Well, these are the 2 that are out, Pfizer and Moderna, but they are still vaccine candidates. And you can see under the first column, platform, it tells you essentially what type of vaccine it's going to be. So these are the mRNA vaccines. The next one that is likely to come out is the AstraZeneca that's working with Oxford University. That's a viral vector vaccine, which we'll talk about briefly as well. So let's go into the AstraZeneca platform, which is the viral vector. This one is a common cold virus, the adenovirus vector technology. So just briefly, a harmless modified version of an adenovirus that usually only spreads among chimpanzees is being used. And why don't they use an adenovirus that would be potentially problematic in a human? Well, if we did that, then the vaccine wouldn't be as effective. It needs to be given, it needs to be utilized essentially in a different species. Altered virus carries a gene from the novel coronavirus to spike protein again, which allows the system to manufacture antibodies. So just a different platform, but it's going to produce, a similar outcome. With this one in particular, the efficacy doesn't seem to be quite as good. If you remember, in July, we had a worldwide shutdown on the evaluation or the research study because there was one woman who developed neurologic symptoms, consistent with something called transverse myelitis. It was found that the woman had multiple sclerosis as well, and there was a connection there. So the UK started the research trial again pretty quickly. It took us a few weeks in the United States, but that's pretty much not an issue. It's been debunked. So we still have a 2-dose series here, 4 to 12 weeks apart. That's quite a range. Greater than 18 years of age or older, stored at fridge temps for up to 6 months. So that's pretty good because that's fridge, stored in the fridge for 6 months. But right now we're looking at a primary efficacy endpoint of 70.4% at preventing COVID-19 occurring greater than or equal 14 days after receiving the 2 doses. The secondary endpoint that they're evaluating, primarily because their efficacy endpoint doesn't look that great, is, well, maybe at least we can see that if somebody does get COVID, because they're only 70% protected, that it's going to be a much, much less virulent outcome, essentially. We've got the Novavax vaccine, which is a protein subunit. This one is genetically engineered recombinant technology with baculoviruses, similar to the adenovirus. It's just using a different one. This one is interesting because with the Novavax, they're inserted this recombinant spike protein into these micelles, which also contain this magic secret adjuvant called Matrix M. Sounds very daunting. The other vaccine that you know of that has an adjuvant that gives you that wonderful giant welt on your arm is Shingrix. So this kind of has similar theme to it. Once injected, it gains entry into the human cells and replicates. It's not live, it's not killed. However, since it contains a subunit of the virus, it should produce a pretty robust immune response. We'll see. This one's produced in Gaithersburg, Maryland, and it's chugging along. We've got some big studies looking at the vaccine, lots of patients enrolled. And again, the endpoint here is to look at preventing symptomatic COVID-19 disease. Pretty well tolerated from what we can tell. Another 2-dose vaccine given 3 weeks apart, like Pfizer. Then we've got the J&J Janssen vaccine. Mechanism for this one is a spike protein that's added to adenovirus, similar type scenario than what we saw to the AstraZeneca. And it's in phase 3 clinical trials. It's called the Ensemble trial. It's 1 or 2 doses. Now the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, Janssen's, I guess, owned by Johnson & Johnson. The Janssen vaccine is most likely going to be a 1-dose vaccine. That's what they're really pushing for. There's a second research study or trial, I should say, evaluating 2 doses, but they're really hoping it'll be a 1-dose vaccine. So they are given the 1 dose and measuring immunity at 14 and 28 days post-vaccine, and it's looking to be about 90% effective. It's stable for 2 years at -4 Fahrenheit and 3 months at fridge temp. So that's pretty good. By the way, they're looking at an EUA maybe February. We'll see. That AstraZeneca vaccine, by the way, which was probably going to be the next one coming out, they have some delays. So I think the AstraZeneca one, they're hoping by later spring. So it may be the Janssen one that comes out the fastest after Pfizer and Moderna. And then we have this Inovio vaccine. A lot of people say if they had a choice, if all these vaccines were available, they would have chosen the Inovio vaccine over the Pfizer or the Moderna. And if you look at the mechanism, most of the time they say that that's why. This one was not funded quite the same way under Operation Warp Speed. Once we saw benefit of the Inovio vaccine, Then you did get some Department of Defense funding, but the initial phase 2-3 trials were funded a good chunk by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So with some people that puts up a red flag, with other people they're like, sign me up. But this one, I would think if you had to worry about a tracker, I don't know, if you got some guy who's like giving a tracker and, you know, luciferase for one thing, I don't know, is this one you have to worry about if you've got the tinfoil hat on for the day? I don't know, but just throwing it out there since we're looking at fact, fiction, and conspiracy theories. The FDA put phase 3 on hold in September due to questions about the delivery system. This one's pretty interesting. So it's still a 2-dose series separated by 4 weeks. It'll be intramuscular or intradermal, which when I first was reading about that a while ago, I thought intradermal, that is weird for a vaccine. Anyhow, mechanism is the mechanism plus the device is what is kind of producing this interesting delivery system problem, according to the FDA. So Inovio's handheld smart device is called a Selectra. So this device, and I have a picture of it there, kind of looks like an electric toothbrush. Device uses an electrical impulse to reversibly open small pores in the cell to allow plasmids to enter. I mean, it's pretty slick if it actually does that. Once the plasmids enter the cell produces the targeted antigen. They have a 95% projected efficacy, but I mean, if you were going to project your efficacy, you wouldn't say, oh, we're hoping for 15%. Of course, you're going to project it high. Pretty stable at room temp for greater than a year and at 37 Celsius for greater than a month. Projected shelf life of 5 years. That's pretty good. And once again, seems to be pretty well tolerated. So I think on the next slide, I had kind of a picture of the vaccine injection and the electric fields. You can see the plasmids opening and then the lymph nodes doing what they do and producing the cells that give the immunity. I don't know. It seems a little gimmicky to me, but time shall tell. I don't know. Polling question number 4. The Inovio vaccine changes your DNA. The Inovio vaccine changes your DNA. All right, you got to tell me when we should end it.
Yeah, I had a mute here. I was saying that someone way back when mentioned knowing that vitamin D3 levels monitor immune system activity, and it has 30 to 100 normal range. However, optimal range 70 to 100. Why not add this test to correlate the severity of symptoms, side effects, death to boost D3?
I think that's a great question. And I think that probably that's something, there are studies, I actually have this at the end of the presentation, kind of things that were still ongoing. Vitamin D3 levels are linked to the immune system. We know that. We are taking it more seriously in the past 10 years. For the most part. And there's absolutely good data showing that, from a functional medicine perspective, D3 on the higher range. I mean, when we're checking somebody's D3, vitamin D levels, most of the time we say, oh, as long as it's 40, you're good. But as mentioned in the question, we think it has to be much higher in order to offer a good immune protection against SARS-CoV-2. So it's an easy test to do. I think it's something that we absolutely should advocate for and do in patients.
Let's do one more before I end the poll here. It
Sure.
says, if someone developed Guillain-Barré from a flu vaccine, how about considering the COVID vaccine? What's your thoughts on that?
That's a great question. So the Guillain-Barré, which we see with a lot of vaccines, I won't say that there's no chance it can occur because of course it might, but it doesn't seem to be a big issue with the mRNA vaccines. And the guidelines suggest if you had Guillain-Barré or Bell's palsy from another vaccine that you're still okay to take the Pfizer, Moderna vaccines that are currently out. It's always balancing risk versus benefit. So are the chances greater that you would get COVID-19 and potentially die or become a chronic COVID patient, long hauler, those lingering symptoms, or are the chances greater that you would get Guillain-Barré and the chances are greater that you would have, big morbidity and mortality with COVID?
And I'll let you kind of take it from there. I'll just make a comment. David mentioned that his wife is a critical care physician. Front line and bottom line, it's still the wild, wild west when it comes to treating and who's going to get sick and who won't. So he was pretty much just supporting prevention. So
that'll be the next big thing, is trying to figure out, we know that the elderly patients and those that have comorbidities, obesity, et cetera, are most likely to get significantly sick with COVID-19, potentially die. But, we're seeing lots of patients that are young and shouldn't get it, or if they do get it, shouldn't get very, very sick, I should say. And some elderly patients that, 90 some years old and live to fight another day. So we're going to be looking at the genetics of this. That's going to be the big thing. So Inovio vaccine changes your DNA. Fact, 3% said yes, fact, and 97% said fiction. It's an interesting question. And again, I'm not poking fun or making light of any of this. I think that every question's a good question. So in general, the reason why I'm going to go with, let me see, fiction is because, well, let's see what Bill Gates says first. It's simple. We manipulate your DNA with a vaccine, implant you with a chip, make society cashless, and put all money on the chip. Then you will do exactly as you're told or return off your chip, and you starve until you decide you're ready to be obedient again. So, this is kind of sometimes have to demonstrate absurdity by being absurd, and that's essentially what this meme says. But here's the interesting part. If you're going to ask the question, it should almost be, I think, more linked to like an mRNA vaccine platform. But in general, with the question that's come up, and it has been more with the mRNA vaccines, Moderna and Pfizer, the mRNA vaccines do not enter the nucleus of the cells. So, which is where the DNA lives. So it would be an impossibility for that to occur. In other words, it's destroyed or, redistributed. It doesn't go into the nucleus of the cells. So what do we have here? Oh, I got to close this. Let's go through some of the side effects real quick. We'll hit those allergies, common side effects of all the vaccines, the pain, the swelling, fever, chills, tiredness, headache, very similar to what we see with, even mild COVID. And again, I mentioned, I had a pretty rough night, but I got up at 4 and felt fine. It was just trying to lay still and sleep that was an impossibility. Helpful tips and when to worry. For pain and discomfort after the vaccine, these are all CDC recommendations and manufacturer recommendations. Consider OTC acetaminophen or non-steroidal over the counter. Apply cool washcloth. Use the arm. Plenty of fluids. And I'm a huge advocate of fluids. And even before you get the vaccine, don't go on a alcohol bender the night before. Try to abstain from alcohol, a couple of days at least ahead of time, and which is something you can map out on paper and say why that makes sense. We haven't proven it, but it just seems good medicine. And hydrate. Try to get a good night's sleep. When to seek help: redness or swelling or tenderness after 24 hours. That could indicate infection mostly, or a reaction. And if the side effects from the vaccine do not go away after a few days. You may have asked the question, and maybe it hasn't come up in your mind. Has anybody died from the vaccine? And the answer is maybe one. We have, there's a Miami physician who got the vaccine right around Christmas time, maybe December 23rd-ish, if I recall. 56-year-old physician in Miami, healthy, no real comorbidities, underlying conditions, got the first dose of the Pfizer vaccine. About 3 days later, he started to get weird spots on his hands and feet. Took himself to his own emergency room. I think he was an emergency room physician. He was admitted, and over the course of the next, 10-ish days, he just had rapid and consistent drop in platelets, and ultimately died. at the hospital. So the best guess is, always look at the most likely culprit, or who worked on the patient last, or what did they take last, and they're looking for a link to the vaccine. So that's being taken very seriously and being evaluated, but scary, but we will continue to monitor that for sure. Polling question number 5, allergic reactions to COVID vaccines are rare, fact or fiction? All right, what do you got? Fact, 89%, fiction, 11%. So that's probably about what I would expect. So as we kind of were talking about a little bit of this earlier, I kind of went through the data. Right now we know that we have less than 30 patients who've had an anaphylactic reaction to either of the COVID vaccines. And when you look at the sheer number that have been vaccinated, it's a minuscule number. Does that mean we shouldn't take it seriously? Of course not. Anything that is a potential, a known or a potential issue with any type of therapeutic intervention should be taken seriously, because if you're the one patient it happens to, even though it might be 1 in 10 million, that's not what I'm saying it is for COVID vaccine, but we have to really worry about that. So this is what we have so far on all that. Non-severe allergic reactions typically occur within 4 hours of the vaccine. They're otherwise known as immediate allergic reactions, which doesn't seem very immediate, but it is, in terms of your body responding to something. Hives, swelling, and even wheezing, respiratory distress. That seems like something pretty severe, but this is considered the non-severe category. CDC recommends that people do not get a second dose of the currently available mRNA vaccines. So if you had that non-severe allergic reaction for the first dose, you shouldn't get the second dose. And that's because you get the second dose, your body's going to remember how awful that first dose was, and you might have that anaphylactic reaction the second time. And that's kind of just how allergies work. Allergic reactions to other types of vaccines or food, pet, venom, environmental, latex, etc. CDC recommends that these people do receive the COVID vaccine. So again, as more people get vaccinated, we're going to have more information, but certainly something to think about. Now, our severe allergic reactions, 29 people as of 1/7/21. This was the anaphylactic group. This person required, these people required epinephrine and or must go to the hospital. And that's kind of what was evaluated as the severe allergic reactions. If a patient has experienced a severe allergic reaction to a COVID vaccine or polyethylene glycol, that's this PEG, or polysorbate, they should not get an mRNA COVID-19 vaccine. So I'm very specific in saying they shouldn't get the mRNA vaccines, which are the 2 that are available, but maybe we hope they can get one of the other vaccines that will be coming out. So, for the small number of patients to which this is going to be an issue, it's important to note that they should be able to take one of the other vaccines with a different platform. And this is everything I actually already said, but just mentioning again, when you go get your vaccine, if you haven't already, if you are not a highly allergenic person, no anaphylactic reactions, you should sit for 15 minutes after the vaccine, and they'll have a spot for you to sit. In my case, it was a big gymnasium where we were all social distancing. And if you've had an anaphylactic reaction, you're going to have to sit for 30 minutes. And again, that's because medicine tells us that you are most likely to have an anaphylactic reaction within 15 minutes of getting the vaccine, on or about. So where vaccines are given, there are appropriate mitigation methods available. Fillers. Now, if you see up here at the top, apparently Vladimir Putin has had fillers in his face. Fact or fiction? I don't know, but it was on the internet, so it must be true. And then we have this young lady over here at the top that's had some sort of plastic surgery. This was something else that's popped up quite a bit. And there was this vaccine and related biological products advisory council, essentially evaluating 2 patients that got the vaccine for Moderna when it was in phase 3, a 46-year-old female who had dermal fillers injected, and a 51-year-old female had undergone the same procedure 2 weeks before vaccination. And essentially they had significant facial swelling after the vaccine. The next question is, should you avoid COVID-19 vaccines if you've had fillers? The answer is no. So something that's continually being evaluated, one of the very many things, but Vladimir Putin should still get the vaccine for sure. Just a real quick thing to show you guys, vaccine adverse event reporting system. We call it VAERS. This is something that's been available since 1990. Did you know that regular adverse events, or non-vaccine adverse events rather, it's not mandatory reporting to the FDA if somebody has had a side effect, or you think somebody's had a side effect to any medication. You really should do it in MedWatch. There's no downside to you reporting a potential side effect to a drug, but it's not mandatory. It is absolutely voluntary. With vaccines, it's mandatory reporting. So there's this VAERS system co-managed by the CDC and the FDA. It's got an early warning system that detects possible safety problems. It kind of helps us gather the information. The COVID vaccine, if a patient has an adverse event associated with the COVID vaccine, you can use VAERS. But, and I actually put in here on the next slide, there's ways to report. And so this is actually an active link, which I'm not going to do just for time purposes, but for reporting, you can just look it up yourself. And these are the objectives for the VAERS. We want to keep track of everything as it pertains to vaccines, particularly serious side effects. A list like this is essentially what you do report to the vaccine adverse event reporting system. And one of these exists, the risks for COVID-19 vaccine. A similar list exists for every US licensed vaccine. What we are using for the COVID vaccine, however, is called vSafe. So VAERS is for every vaccine. You certainly could report a COVID-19 vaccine adverse event on the VAERS site, but the vSafe is the one that's being promoted by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So I've been on it. It's pretty easy to use, very simple questions that you go through, and they will tell you about the vSafe when you go get your vaccine. They'll ask you to scan a QR code, et cetera, if you want to, but it's pretty easy to use. Post-vaccine etiquette, I already mentioned this. We're still going to wear masks. We're still going to social distance. We're still going to wash our hands, et cetera. And we're going to do that until, we have the majority of people that have been vaccinated. I don't know if we're going to do it until, I think Dr. Fauci now says we have to have 85% immunity in order to have herd immunity. So that'll be a long time, but we're going to find out how long we're all going to be wearing masks or what the protocol is going to be. Who pays for the vaccine? Well, you do, but you just don't pay for it at the time you're getting it. So it is a free vaccine. It's paid for by the US taxpayer dollars. So when you go and you get your vaccine, when you register, they will ask you for an insurance card. You can say, I have no insurance, and you'll still get the vaccine. But most places are going to try to recoup just an immunization professional fee, in other words. So getting paid something from your insurance to pay for their time and the fact that they immunized you. But the vaccine is free. So what else do we have here? How are we doing on time? How about we do the vaccine allocation real quick, because that's a hot topic.
Okay, but we are getting kind of close to our landing time, so let's.
I need 1 minute. Not even. All right, vaccine allocation priorities. It is a dumpster fire. The 1A, which is the initial rollout, between the ACIP and the CDC, which are kind of the two organizations that come up with this. the initial rollout wasn't too bad. Most of the 1As have been vaccinated. So our long-term care facility residents and our healthcare professionals, some states have moved to 1B. 1B is going to be people who are 75 and older, as well as some other essential workers. And the problem is, it's really, what we've been given from the CDC and ACIP is a set of guidelines telling states and counties what to do regarding the rollout of the vaccine. And it's guidance, it's not a mandate. So in the next couple of weeks, I think we're really going to see more people being vaccinated in the other categories. So here, phase 1B, you can see people greater than or equal to 75 years old. Well, there's no reason we can't bring in people 65 and up to do it. And you're going to see that in more places. I'm in Bucks County. I think Bucks County's done a lousy job. I actually got vaccinated in Montgomery County because I work there, and I think they're doing a fantastic job. So a lot of it is just red tape. So this is just looking at, kind of the typical plan in terms of how they wanted it to unfold. But, each state has its own set of guidelines, and that's what we are held hostage to. Oh, by the way, you can get vaccinated in a different state. You can get vaccinated in a different county. So who knows? We might be all screaming road trip and going someplace where it's more readily available.
And then when you do the road trip, you come back and you have to quarantine for 14 days. Tracy, that was awesome. We knew you wouldn't get through all the slides. And so we debated whether or not to cut the slides off or turn it into a handout. So everyone out there, the handout I did launch quite a ways back. It will be a link in tonight's survey. It goes out at 10 o'clock. And also it'll be in tomorrow. So you have the handout there. There's tons of information. But Tracy, as always, you did a great job. I missed lecturing with you this time, but we'll catch it on something else. But, you did a great job. Thank you for doing that.
My pleasure.
Joe, yeah. So Joe, do you have any comments before I move into some more housekeeping?
Well, not comments other than that there is a plethora of information that was just done so well. It's just amazing how versatile and versed you are on this, Tracy. It was really a privilege to listen to you. But there are two questions that came through kind of, I think, twice, and I think they really want to get them answered. So I'm gonna read them off to you if we get just a real quick answer. How do we know if we're eligible to donate plasma after we had COVID?
Pretty much anybody's eligible. You can contact your local health department and they will set you up with a convalescent plasma site. And then, they kind of evaluate you very similar to the Red Cross when you're donating blood. So they'll check your antibody levels, and that's, the higher the antibody levels, the more valuable you are. So yeah, anybody who's had COVID, go donate if you can. Contact your health department and they'll get you set up, send you to the right place to get set up.
And if you contracted COVID, do you still need to get the vaccine?
Oh, great question. The answer is yes. The question is when. So if you've had COVID in the last 90 days, you should, let me just even make it more simple than that. You do need the vaccine if you've had COVID. We just don't know exactly when you would need it. So the recommendation is now let the rest of the world, the rest of the United States get vaccinated. So if you were a physician who had COVID, you would not be 1A for getting vaccinated. You should be after phase 2. So there's 1A, 1B, 1C, and then phase 2. And then, the people who've had COVID should get vaccinated after that, once everybody else has had the opportunity to also gain immunity through vaccination.
Thank you, Joe. Any last questions you want to get in under the wire?
No, we're at the point where everybody is just thanking you, Tracy, for a wonderful presentation.
It was my pleasure.
Thanks,
and thanking Greg for holding her beer.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Next time you, Tracy, but we like tequila. But anyway, thank you for taking COVID-19 updates and treatments and vaccines, fact, fiction, and conspiracy theory. Tracy did a great job. I have a few housekeeping things here.